Today we're going to go over the steps required for building a PL-259 connector and affixing it to our RG-213 cable. RG-213 is fairly common throughout the Coast Guard, both in UHF and HF communications applications. So what you see here is what you'll be doing out there. Go ahead and grab your ruler and measure down from the tip of your 213 cable 1 1/4 inch down. Once you've done that, use the colored pencil to make a mark. This mark is going to serve as the reference for when we start to cut through the jacket so we can gain access to our braided shield, insulation, and eventually center conductor. You can use cable strippers, electrician scissors, or even a folding pocket knife, which is what I'm going to be doing today. Go ahead and place it like so and apply a fair amount of pressure, just enough to start cutting through the outside of the cable about 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters down. After you've made a pass 360 degrees, you can make a straight cut down the long edge of the cable. Sometimes you may have to make a second pass. You'll know that you've gone deep enough because you will feel a bit of resistance from the braided shield beneath it. Go ahead and secure your tool, whether it's a folding pocket knife, scissors, or wire strippers. And now you can peel back the jacket like so. Go ahead and flare out the braided shield. This is fairly soft copper, so it's not too hard. And once you've got a nice little flare going on there, start to tuck it back, and you're going to want to fold it back down over the jacket, fully exposing our insulation. Once you have all of the insulation exposed, like so, go ahead and lay it down next to your roller again and mark 3/8. Once you've done that, go ahead and grab the actual wire strippers, taking note of the rough size of your center conductor and picking an appropriate size on the wire strippers. You will clamp it down like so, apply moderate pressure, and give it a few twists. This will score and cut through all of your insulation, but not down ideally far enough to cut through your center conductor. It can be tough, so you, again, use some moderate force to pull it off, and that exposes the center conductor. Once our center conductor is exposed, we're ready to move on to the next step, where we will do some soldering. All we need to do is apply a little bit of tin to our center conductor, and then we can work on trimming off our braided shield. Now that we are done tinning our center conductor, we're ready to move on to our next step, which will be trimming down the braided shield. We want to use our scissors to trim down the braided shield to the point where it is no longer than our insulation. So I'll prepare my catch tray and solder station before I begin. Then I will flare out my braided shield. Again, fairly soft copper, so this isn't a difficult task. And then I will make an initial pass, trimming it down. This is good for cutting off the bulk of it, but you're going to want to check it out again and perhaps even unbraid even a little bit more of the shield, because as it gets unbraided, it does reveal itself to be a little longer than you may have thought. And ultimately, again, our goal is to have it be shorter than our insulation so it does not make any contact with our center conductor. After I complete my second pass, I'll do a cursory glance and check it out. Make sure none of the strands are making contact with that center conductor. And it appears we've got a couple that are doing just that, despite my best efforts. So, make a final snip here and there. And it's good to go. We're going to set it in our vise, which acts like a third hand for us here. Now, what we came here for, this is the PL-259 connector. The PL-259 has two very simple parts. One, we have the collar of the connector, which threads off like so. And after it's threaded off, you will slide it over your cable. This is important to go first because it threads back over the body of the PL-259 connector and eventually hooks up to whatever's on the receiving end of this. The body of the PL-259 goes onto the end of the cable, and you will start to thread it on by hand. The inside of the body has reversed threads, so as you tighten it, it will grab onto the jacket and start to pull itself on. This does take a considerable amount of force, so ensure that your vise is holding onto the cable nice and tight, and do your best to turn by hand. And we're going to continue to turn it until we can see our braided shield through the holes on the side of the connector. We didn't quite get there by hand, so I grabbed a pair of channel locks and recommend you do the same if you have difficulty, and that makes it a lot easier for you to thread it on the remaining 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch that sometimes you just can't get by hand. After you've done a good job tightening it down, I like to check it out and make sure we don't have any of our braided shield peeking out from underneath the body of the connector. I also like to make sure I can see that braided shield through these little side windows of the body of the connector. This is important because we're going to be applying some small dollops of solder, making a very nice, strong bond between the shield and the PL-259. Go ahead and wet my sponge here. I'm going to drop a little bit of flux, just literally a drop or two, into each of these little windows on the body of the connector. Brush off the seasoning here into my catch tray, thermally shock the soldering tip, apply just a lick of solder there. There are a few different techniques that you can use when applying solder through these windows. One, you can do what I'm doing here and heat up the body of the connector where your flux is, and then drop that solder directly into it. You can also heat up the body of the connector and feed it through bit by bit into the hole or the window. Unfortunately, this is a fairly tedious task, but nonetheless, it is a very important one and a step that you do not want to skip. Here we will do a bit of a time lapse and speed this up. The process on one of these viewing windows is the same as any of the viewing windows. Again, there are a couple of techniques that you can do to do this effectively, both of which first involve you applying a bit of liquid flux to each of the windows directly onto your braided shield. You can heat the body of the connector and feed it directly through, as I'm doing right now. And then you can sort of smooth it over and make it nice and flush. Again, doing your best not to apply too much solder, because if you apply too much solder, it can become too bulky for the collar to slide back over the body of the connector. Again, very gently, just adding a bit of flux, a bit of heat, a bit of solder to these viewing windows to make a nice, strong bond between the body of our connector and our braided shield. Now that I've added what I believe is an adequate amount of solder to each of the windows on the body of the connector, I'll secure my soldering station and do a visual inspection. Oh boy. Oh boy. I did exactly what I warned against and added too much solder. I can already tell by looking at it that it's going to be difficult to get the collar over that, so I'm going to use this little wick here. This wick is great for wicking up excess solder, as the name implies. You turn your soldering iron back on, get it up to the nice 650 degrees temperature we recommend, and apply pressure between the solder that you want to remove, the wick, and your iron. And as you can tell by this color change, it is wicking up all of the excess solder that I put on there and do not want. It can be a little bit testy. As you saw back there, I was struggling a bit. I let go of the heat application before I pulled it off, and it immediately got stuck to the connector, so be careful not to do that. But if it does, it's not the end of the world. You just need to reapply some heat to make that solder loose and release the grasp it has on your wick. I would like to again express caution. Hold it on the plastic body of the spool. That will not carry the heat that this braided copper will. And if you touch it, it definitely hurts. It'll let you know. And if you do it once, that's probably about all it'll take. Oh, yep. See, you just did it right there. I will not be doing that again. And again, apply the heat directly on top of the wick and have that on top of the solder that you want to remove until you successfully remove the amount of copper you desire. So, I'll trim off my spent wick here using my diagonal cutters. Go ahead and drop those trimmings here into my little capture tray and do a visual inspection. That looks acceptable to me, so I'm going to put it back into my vice grip here for safekeeping and holding. Grab some isopropyl alcohol and my acid brush and start to clean off as much of this excess flux that I've got caked on here as possible. While I was applying that bit of isopropyl alcohol, I did notice that there was another area I wanted to touch up a bit more with some solder. That's a-okay here. Just gonna do a little dab. Just a little dollop is all this PL-259 needed. And smooth that over. Nice and easy like. There we go. Apply a little bit of seasoning to the soldering iron, secure my station. Now I'm ready to move on to the next step. What we want to do here is snip off the center conductor that is protruding from the tip of our PL-259. I use my diagonal cutters, and my goal is to make it flush with the brass end that is permanently attached to this connector. So I'll hook onto there, point it down, because this thing is going to go flying. Yep. There we are. Make it nice and flush. Give her another trim, like so. Now our center conductor is prepared and ready to receive solder. Ideally, the tip of this connector should have a rounded end. There is a little, almost cup-like shape that your goal is to fill with solder so that you have a rounded end covering your center conductor, but not so large that it won't plug into whatever needs to receive this. I'll do another check here as I did the last time I applied solder. Unfortunately, I can already tell I applied too much, so I will grab my wick again, and with my wick, I will wick away the excess solder I applied. Now that I've successfully removed any of my excess solder with my wick, I'll use more isopropyl alcohol with my acid brush and brush away all of that leftover flux on my center conductor. Sometimes the flux is really baked onto here, so you will have to be persistent and liberal in your application of isopropyl alcohol with this here acid brush. You'll notice that the brush is trimmed very short, and that gives you a little bit more rigid bristles, which are especially helpful with knocking off the flux that gets caked onto these connectors sometimes. Going to give this another visual inspection here. Brush off just a little bit of leftover flux and make this a brilliant finish to our connector. Now that I am getting these last stubborn bits of flux off of my center conductor, secure my soldering station. Do another check here. It looks great to me. I've got solder filling all of those cups, so let me show you all how it looked and how yours should look as well. Nice and smooth, covering each of those viewing windows and making a nice solid bond between body of connector and braided shield. Go ahead and thread this on. Lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. There should be some play in there that is totally normal. Again, it backs all the way down seamlessly and will thread all the way back up seamlessly. That's how you know you don't have any solder stuck in the threads on there, and you're good to go.